Member Toll? Absent for the moment. Sorry. Member Meyer?
Here.
And Chair Inkerman.
Here. Okay. The first item is an oral declaration regarding in-person meetings of subsidiary boards and commissions. Pursuant to recently adopted amendments in the Illinois Open Meetings Act, included in Public Act 101-0640, public bodies may in certain circumstances hold entirely virtual public meetings without a forum physically present at any one location. On March 18, 2020, the village president issued a declaration of emergency pursuant to the authority granted by the Village Code, Illinois Municipal Code, and the Illinois Emergency Management Agency Act, which addressed the health issue proposed by who addressed the health proposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we're missing a word there. On May 29, 2020, Governor Pritzker issued a disaster proclamation that declared in-person attendance at public meetings of more than 10 people at a regular public meeting location to be infeasible in accordance with the Illinois Open Meetings Act as a Public Act 01-0640. On June 16, 2020, Village President O'Hara executed a written determination that given the ongoing emergency associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person meetings of the village board, and other commissions of the village are not practical or prudent at this time until further notice. In accordance with the governor's disaster proclamation and the village president's declaration of emergency, the determination regarding meetings of the village board, I, Barbara Enkenman, chair of the Finance Committee of the Village of Lake Bluff, hereby determine that in-person meetings of the Village of Lake Bluff Finance Committee are not practical or prudent at this time and until further notice. All right. The next item of business would be approval of the minutes for the October 19th, 2020 Finance Committee meeting. And I think I can group together with it the second set of minutes from the October 22nd, 2020 Finance Committee meeting. Is that proper to do those lumped together, right?
You can take them collectively or one at a time.
All right. Do I have a motion?
So moved to approve.
And I will second. Are there any items to discuss regarding corrections, updates?
Not that I have.
Okay. Hearing none. We have a roll call.
Trustee Meyer?
Aye.
Chair Inkerman.
Aye.
Minutes are approved.
Okay. At this time, the Finance Committee has allotted 15 minutes for any individuals who would like the opportunity to address the Finance Committee on any matter that is not listed on this evening's agenda. Drew or Glenn, do we have anyone who is virtually attending who'd like to say something, or in person?
No, ma'am.
0 attendees for this exciting stuff, Barbara.
All right.
Don't take it personally.
Okay, so the next order of business is an operating budget review. We've had quite a year, and of course things are never as we had originally thought they would be. So we have an update that Drew, you and Bettina want to queue up what you've...
Sure. And I won't necessarily share the screen quite yet, but I'll give the overview in the memo provided to the board and to the Finance Committee as well, really. There is an overarching plan here, and that is really maintaining the status quo with respect to operations, programs, and services. I'll touch on an ever slight deviation, but it's ever so slight, but I'll get to that later. But it's really the village picking up where it left off pre-pandemic in terms of reinvesting in its assets and systems, essentially capital, as well as all these expenditures that we've outlined in this draft budget is consistent with the village's strategic plan as well as its fiscal policies, goals, and objectives. So the documents really is focusing on the general fund tonight. There's future plans to discuss the water fund and the other funds, but we spent a lot of time with general fund and capital tonight, and it's really the meat of the budget, given that there's really nothing of note operationally different for the village. So I'm going to jump right in, but I'm going to talk about some of the, I would call smaller but noteworthy items that I would think you'd have an interest in. Some of these were in the draft budget last year that you didn't see, and some of them got put to the side or the back of the stove when we hit the pandemic, and so some of these will look very familiar to you. So I'll start with under admin, there's a bicycle repair station, there's bike racks. Related to that, the village has just engaged a planning firm of Tesca and Associates to help us go through the streetscape layout. The committee of the whole met 2 weeks ago and talked about some alternative street designs and also some, I would say, aesthetic street designs as well, streetscapes, in addition to possibly changing some of the layout and flow of traffic in the CBD. But this is some of the planned, I would call it street furniture that Tesca is going to help us lay out where that is. The ABR has some ideas for that as well. So there's more information coming to you with regards to the downtown streetscape as well as the downtown layout in terms of street configuration. But these are some of the items that will flow from that conversation, we suspect, and want to be prepared to pull the trigger when those happen. Buckthorn Route 176 clearance. This is a project the village has put together the gateway plan and has been trying to get this done, and kind of chipping away at that. This is something that we would look to pick up again. We tried to do it this year, but we got set to the back burner because of COVID. Litigation expenses are up, and the village continues to be tied up in litigation with Stonebridge, and that's really the gist of it. And so we expect those dollars to continue to be demanded for that purpose. The next two items, the PEG equipment and the joint greenhouse gas inventory. So those were two projects that we have been talking about with the city of Lake Forest, projects that we would do. The village has an intergovernmental agreement with Lake Forest with respect to our audiovisual programs, cable TV, and we had a piece of equipment that is both a security concern as well as its useful life has been reached. We, up until Friday, were potentially facing 50-50 cost for a product hardware rather, that's $45,000. We have since found a $12,000 solution, and we think that's much better and much more cost effective. The only wrinkle from a service, brace yourselves, right now the village has programming where we run videos, sometimes of old village board, committee of the whole, ABR, I'll call them reruns of videos, which that's not to say that you cannot go to the village's website and go and on-demand watch any of these meetings anytime you want. So the one wrinkle is by going with this significantly lower priced hardware solution is that we would no longer be able to run, I would call it long content video. That doesn't mean like right now, if you turn on your cable, you could turn on, you would see this committee of the whole meeting. You would still see things live stream. It's just that we wouldn't be doing reruns anymore, so to speak. But that doesn't mean you can't go out to the website again and catch anything on demand that you want whenever you want. So we didn't view that as a big negative. And unfortunately, we've never had the data about who's even watching the videos. We know some people, based off communications, like, the quality of the television program tonight is terrible or great. Occasionally we get a handful of viewers that are doing that and let us know. But in this particular case, we don't think that's a negative to take that one step, losing that utility, if you will. So really
Drew, so I'm very clear about this. If somebody desires reruns, they can get them on the website. Did I hear that correctly?
Exactly. Anytime,
There'll be
24/7.
no impediment to that.
Right.
Okay. Very
And
good.
that's also to say that right now, any video, the live stream, they can watch this right now. If they were, if it was must-see TV and they wanted to catch the 7 o'clock board meeting, they can turn on the channel and catch that. Alternatively, if they were traveling and couldn't see it, they can watch it on the internet as well, but they can also, if they landed it at midnight in Spain, they can go to their computer and watch it. So that means
They
that,
can also DDR it.
yes, true. So that PEG replacement number, 22.5, is actually going to come down dramatically. It's going to be a lot closer to 7,000. So we'll make that amendment, but that's news. Likewise, the joint greenhouse gas inventory action plan, that's something that's really, the scale of that is closer to $85,000, $90,000. But if we piggybacked and did it jointly with the city of Lake Forest, our cost would be dramatically different. And that $20,000 is what we would look to pay as part of a joint project. Unfortunately, Lake Forest has decided not to do that this fiscal year. And so had I had that information before this was printed, I wouldn't even be recommending it. So that cost, I would recommend not be taken on. That was something that's not specifically in the village's sustainability and community enhancement sustainability plan, the plan that the village has adopted. But that certainly fits into the wheelhouse of their interest, and we suspect they would want to do a project like that if it made sense to do it economically, and given the circumstances with Lake Forest, it doesn't make sense for us to move independently on that. The village's branding and marketing campaign, that's an initiative the board has certainly directed me to invest time and resources into. I've been working with a volunteer group, a steering committee that's put together in January of this year, and great bunch of folks. We've been meeting, and I'm putting together actually a request for proposals to push out to the marketing community and get some proposals back. But right now, the number that the committee we've been talking about is to have a budget of $50,000 to go out and do that. And that could be a multi-year program. It could be, depending on the actual campaign, what that looks like between print, digital, and other materials. But that's the number that we've been talking about. That would be, I guess, powerful enough to move a dial. Moving on, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. Anybody has questions along the way, but otherwise I'll keep moving.
I just wanted to say briefly that joint greenhouses gas inventory action. If the SEC decided they wanted to do something like that, would they have first, the opportunity to present it to the board and get approval, or how much independence do they have in spending something that's that significant?
Zero. So that's the short answer, right? So yeah, and frankly, that's if it's not in the budget and it exceeds my authority, it's coming to you. So that's how it would work.
Yeah, because this is a measurement tool, and it's important for us to have a baseline to see where we are presently, and to register improvement. But I don't know that we would probably want to implement something that actually benefits us before trying to spend $20,000 on a measurement tool that's broad and not specific. That's just my thought.
So moving right along, if that's all right, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about outsourcing the assistant finance director position. You'll see that's one of the reasons why we've been able to achieve some personnel savings. And so that's what you see there. That's the outsourced cost. Fire department, we have the final year in this upcoming budget of our settlement payment. As you recall, there was a dispute with Lake Forest on our ambulance bills, so we're finally getting through the tunnel on that. This is the third year of that agreed to payment schedule with them. There's also a dispatch station alerting system, and frankly, I don't know if Member Toll has such a thing in his own fire department. They call it the Brain. I don't know if you have those in your station.
We don't call it the Brain, but yeah, we have something like that.
Yeah, so it's it's a communication tool that goes from dispatch to our firefighters and EMS providers. That's a tool it's building on a system that our dispatch agency, Glenview, is putting in. This is our small cost to share with that to make it fully functional in our firehouse. But that's a new tool the fire department's excited about, and I think over time there may be other appurtenances associated with that. But for now, that's where they want to go and what Chief Graff is recommending. It's time to replace some defib monitors and our air pack equipment. we've got a significant grant in for a lot of this stuff, this air pack equipment, so hopefully we can get that, but we're also budgeting for it because we know we need some, and we're gonna have to replace much of it in the next 2 years, but we're hopeful that we're gonna get an Assistance to Firefighters grant for that, and that's what we've put in for, so. But we're trying to account for those expenses now. And then moving right along, there's a significant section of path that we need to repave, if you will, in Tangley, as well as right out in front of the Lake Bluff Elementary School. The pathway, if you're familiar with that intersection at West Washington and Green Bay Road, the path is actually on the outside or between the road and the guardrail, and we want to flip that and put the pathway on the inside of the guardrail so as to have that protection there for the users. And that, you know, it's asphalt, so it's very expensive, so that's a $380K expense. We've got we're starting to get into rollover territory, but the McClory pedestrian bridge work is supposed to start in April. They've got to be done right now. I think July 1 is the completion date for that McClory Bridge project, but that represents the cost of that project. Again, that's the one that we're doing jointly with the county and the state. And Forest Cove lift station improvements, we had budgeted last year lift station improvements, plural, but the cost of those, I think we only had one bidder. We ended up only being able to do one of those projects, so we had to split it, and essentially that project got doubled just because that's what the cost to do. I mean, our engineer's estimate was off, and so we've had to add more to get that project done. That's what's reflected in the $240K. It's time to replace the public safety AC. We are clearing up. I think we probably underrepresented the cost of the squad car. When you buy a new police cruiser or vehicle, the cost to upgrade it and outfit it with all the bells and whistles and electronics equipment is very expensive, and I think we didn't have enough in there, and that's why we're buying two, so we need to add in 20 to get that done. And we have the benefit of having our health insurance. Some of our expenses are rolling off based off a reserve assessment that we've gotten through that 3-year window. Although we were seeing a 10% increase in the annual. And we're looking at about $600K in road resurfacing, although that number may change. Hopefully we get through this winter with all the freeze thaw that it's not as bad as we think it may be. But that's kind of the high level noteworthy points. Again, I kind of went through that pretty quickly. If you have any other questions about it, happy to answer any. Same with Bettina. Again, it all should look fairly familiar. A lot of this is rollover from just hitting the pause button from pandemic. So
I don't have any particular questions. Maybe one little detail, Drew, just out of curiosity. The outsourcing of the assistant finance director position, is there a possibility that it will come under 80? Are we paying per hour, or do we have a fixed fee kind of situation, or what do we have?
Can I answer that question, Drew?
please.
So it's a fixed contractual annual rate that we pay a monthly fee for.
Okay. All right, so we'll be at 80 no matter what, even if there's less work done or more work done.
True.
Very good, thank you.
What's the contra to that, though? Well, there's a head count that we're not filling, so in effect, that's less than. That's a cost out, but in this particular case,
it's a net
facilitates
savings.
a cost reduction. Yeah.
Right. So savings, I think, don't have that spreadsheet right in front of me, but from when we did that analysis, I think it was about $40,000 to $50,000, depending on salary for the employee and what benefits they chose.
I think,
It's got to be
that's
40 or 50, Mark, for sure.
Right.
Plus, there's a tax benefit too, because you got to pay for, I presume, for their Social Security and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, I guess, I just wanted to put an asterisk. Unlike the rest of these, a bicycle rack, which is outflow, we're actually facilitating a cost reduction by
Right.
by that payment of 80. So,
Yeah, it's probably a net savings of about $60,000.
okay.
Yep,
Excellent. Thank you.
sure.
Bettina, I was looking to share my screen to show the general fund item. Oh, here it is. All right, I got it.
You want me to do it?
I got it.
Okay.
So the next item, all these expenses, we can largely talking about the general fund balance, and the village's goal is to have 50% of year's operations on hand. And the program that we've laid out for this year, and it shows a look out into the future, a year out beyond our most immediate out year, but we're within that threshold. I think the first time we put these numbers together, we were slightly under 50%, and we went back and looked at some of the numbers and modified some of the revenues to make it probably still conservative, but slightly more, I think, realistic than where we think the numbers are going to come in. And we actually had a conversation earlier today with Chair Anchorman about that, about the revenue stream and how, what is everybody's risk tolerance, risk, and comfort with how aggressive we program those revenue streams, because it really does matter and impact what the fund balances look like. And so, I think we talked about it, the idea that the sales tax numbers are doing fairly well. But there's a lot of other one-off revenue streams that are really bumpy and clunky and very difficult to predict. And so we think this is a conservative approach to fiscal planning, which is consistent with the village's practice over the years. And again, when you look at the numbers there and you see the numbers that are significantly higher than the village's goal, the 84s and 80, back to back, those were, again, this is coming out of the pandemic where we plan to keep it purposely high to roll down and be prepared to have a softer cushion. Likewise, going back in FY17, the village took those monies and put them into capital, the CAP fund, and created that capital fund. And the idea that the village certainly has capital expenditure needs that far exceed dollars on hand or dollars even planned to have on hand. And that's one of the reasons why we've been having conversations about creating a utility fund to help, a stormwater utility fund, rather, to help fund a lot of these stormwater projects that are of significant scale.
Along those lines, just looking at the last metric, it says personnel expenditures as a percent of operating revenues. Those numbers in 2022 and 2023, given the conservative nature of the projected revenues, it does make personnel look a little higher than what it had been historically. And so I think it's that conservatism that's making those percentages look a little high, not that we're growing our head count or have any out of control personnel expenses. Is that correct?
Yeah, to the contrary, the number, as we talked about, we're down to 34 regular full-time employees, and the personnel expenses are actually down.
Thank you.
Yep. Bear with me, I'm going to pop up the last one.
Capital, Drew?
Yep.
For some reason, I apologize, this PDF pushed the last column to the second page, so.
I saw that.
Yes, there it is. But I guess what's important to take, I asked Bettina to put this together. This is just to show historically what the village has spent, the ebb and flow on capital. I mean, that's been a longstanding goal of the villages, and certainly in the last two strategic plans, to continue to invest in our village-owned assets. And you can see that the trend line has certainly continued to move, and the trajectory is going in the right direction in terms of the village's continuation of spending on capital. And that goes back to years ago when, I'll go back to 2008, when I arrived, the idea that the collective goal was to take money out of the operations bucket and put it in capital, and keep having to get a different bucket for capital that's bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what we've been doing and continue to do, and I think that's reflected here in the trends. I just wanted to share that with you all. And I mean, one of the good news in here that it's, it's so much of the world we live in, sadly to say, is what have you done for me lately? But the idea that we have replaced all of our water meters, or at least 90%, those last little hangers on that are related to COVID, the folks who weren't really comfortable with us getting inside yet, but we have completed that to 90% level. Hats off to Jeff and the others and the contractor to get all that done despite the pandemic. So that was a significant expense in our water fund. We're not talking about the water fund tonight, but there's some other projects that we'll be talking about doing coming up in the near future. But that's another system that the village has that has a number of great demands with limited revenue streams.
I'm looking forward to talking about that process of storm water utility fees and also just capital, the fund in general, how we prepare the fund and flow things through it. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
I could just give a small introduction or comment with regard to that.
That'd be great.
So the fund, the sheet that Drew just had up, kind of just gives a good graphical view of how we've done more of a pay-as-you-go type of approach to the capital fund, and not even capital, was all through general, and now we have a capital fund that I'd like to create a plan document for that gives some sort of direction via the board and the finance committee as to how that fund is funded, whether that be a percentage of revenue over what we have budgeted for that gets allocated per year, or however the committee decides, but some sort of plan as to what gets allocated into that capital fund, similar to how we alternate with MFT, between MFT dollars and general fund money. There's some sort of plan and some sort of written process there so that we can actually track and plan for expenditures out in a better way. Yep.
And that's that is a
exciting.
fun, interesting topic, but Bettina had mentioned it. We have these conversations from time to time at the finance committee level about what is the appropriate mix in terms of pay-as-you-go and also, the debt and the idea there's a lot of assets that have a very useful life that far extends, 5, 10, 20 years, and some of these water mains certainly 100 years, we hope. But the idea of what's the right blend of expenditure so that today's residents aren't bearing the cost for 100 years from now, right? Trying to find that sweet spot of that blend of expenses and how we approach it. And there's certainly some towns that have, a philosophy of zero debt, and there's others that are the other side of that continuum. So I think the village of Lake Bluff is, Bettina, you'll see there's splashes of, a big expense in the water fund, or, in the village historically, up until recently, has had very little, I would say, dollars that are discretionary that it could be used towards capital. Only recently, with the sales tax dollars coming in, that the village has had more monies available to actually invest in its capital. And fortunately for the village, that those land use decisions are paying dividends today so that you can have those investment opportunities.
We're also very, very fortunate to be able to be in that position from the market standpoint with borrowing costs so exceedingly low, so that it facilitates that conversation about finding the mix and matching up projects with funding and funding approaches.
That's right.
Just keep in mind, if we're thinking of borrowing some money, we're probably going to see interest rates rising. There is a bit of a, kerfluffle in the stock market today that's probably indicative of interest rates going up over a long period of time this year. So I don't know that there's anything in particular we'd want to fund by borrowing money, but just let's be mindful of it.
Well, it's still exceedingly low historically, and particularly for municipal bonds, tax-free it's an affordable alternative for the right project.
Bettina, do you have the ability to share the multi-year capital that you and Jeff and I have been talking about, the 10-year? I don't know if that's...
Yep. 1 second.
So one of the things that we've been doing too is going back and revisiting our multi-year capital plan, which is we have a 10-year plan, and making sure that we've accounted for, one, the audit or inventory. We've accounted for everything, right? That the village has been spending money on lift stations and getting these, and making sure we have the appropriate useful life. Same with bridges and water mains, and trying to find that right amount of investment in our system. I'm seeing if Jeff, are you on the call? I was trying to find Jeff but what I wanted to share was we've been part of a grant award, if you will, that there's a group that's going to give the village an assessment of its pavement. So the idea that our roads, over the years, the village's engineer has gone out and assessed our roads and used our own scorecard to go out and say, okay, these roads should be done next, and these roads are next in terms of order priority. And now we're going to get I'll call it a pavement management system grading that is, I would say, maybe more clinical in its production of the list of roads that should get resurfaced. And sometimes I've seen that when that's been implemented, sometimes you may get a head scratcher and you say, well, that was just replaced, or something it doesn't look as bad as this road. Well, that has to do with maybe, how many users are on that road, and some, information about the submaterial, the base, and so forth. But nonetheless, we're going to get that. So we'll have that data for you next year. But I think that's exciting that we'll start to have some more information, empirical data for you all to make these decisions and so forth. So, Bettina, you want to walk them through this?
Okay.
I'm happy to do it too.
Basically, I'm not as good at the project aspect of it.
Yeah.
I'm more into the numbers of it. But so, FY22 original budgeted numbers for the capital projects that are listed numerically on the left. The original budget numbers are here, and the updated budget numbers are in the bluer column. There have been some, as Drew mentioned earlier, some additions and some rollover cost changes from year to year associated with some of those projects. So, for example, the underpass Head Bridge was not originally this year. It was requested in 21, and now we're rolling it over for 375 in FY22. Similarly, the Forest Cove lift station improvements are listed here as newly requested, and they weren't part of the original budget request.
Bettina, can I interrupt you? I'm sorry. I'm looking at line 13. If each project's got a number on it, I wanted to point out that Boardman Court, the village has been talking about this project for some time, and I wanted to point it out that, speaking with village engineer Jeff Hansen, that he thought it would be best to, if the village is going to do that project, to put it in FY26. That's when that Boardman Court, that specific area, would be the most efficient time to do that, because the village will be resurfacing the road at that point. And if the village is going to do it, that'd be the best time to do it. Now, that's not to say that the village, I think before that point, the village board would have made a decision with regards to establishing a stormwater utility fund. And then I think those projects would be put in the blend and the mixed, if you will, to have a prioritization and see where those may all fall. But I think, just generally thinking, that's if there would be an opportunity again for economies of scale, that's what the win. So that's why it's in that fiscal year, and I just wanted to point that out.
So then the addition of the Forest Cove lift station improvement to the upcoming budget year is added. So it brings the total difference between one year and the other to 1.1 million and some change. The MST fund, no changes. Water replacement, there's some residual costs that we're anticipating associated maybe with the meter replacement and the big water main replacement dollars and pump station dollars.
I'm
water
sorry.
main those would all be coming off of the leftover bond money that we have, which is about $900,000.
Bettina, I'm sorry, can you go back up to the MFT?
Sure.
So another point in with this is if you look out in FY24, there's an additional expense there. It's called Rebuild Illinois. That's line actually 23. Those are dollars that the state has handed over to us. Actually, we've gotten, what, half of those right now, Bettina?
Yes.
So there's Illinois has issued debt.
Not quite.
Yeah, and they've give us some of those payments. The village and every other municipality who gets MFT dollars has been given those funds, and you can use. There's a limit in what they can be used for in terms of it's. They don't want it to go for, I would call your typical resurfacing, but as well as they're hoping, and you can't use it for bridges. You can use it for new streets and some. Basically, there's limitations on that money, but we think, based off our communications with our consultants, that we could use that dollar on doing significant resurfacings in the community. So that year will be a banner year in terms of resurfacing. And so we would look to do a lot of streets in that year with a significantly higher budget than what we would normally do. And the reason why that is when you're doing MFT, there's additional expenses and administrative work. And so if we were going to be doing that work anyway as another MFT year, we figured we'd just bundle all that together and do it at once. But the Illinois Rebuild Illinois work has to be you must spend all that money by 2025. So that's why we put it in that year and tried to bundle it when we thought we would have all the dollars. Now I'll tell you, the governor's budget, at least as I understand it, is maybe taking some of those dollars. We may not see 100% of those. We've only, like I said, there's 4 payments to be made. We've gotten 2 of them. So there's an asterisk whether we're going to actually have $377,000 and change to spend, but at least right now we have half of it. So.
And there's no way it can be applied to Green Bay.
So, yeah, it could. The question with that, though, is we're worried that we wouldn't want to be handcuffed. And we actually had to provide a survey data back to the state about when and how did we think we'd spend this money. And we had talked about the 2 projects would be MFT resurfacing dollars and Green Bay Road. The problem with Green Bay Road is it's possible that we may not have the 80/20 ready in time to do that, and we just didn't want the window to close and lose out on those dollars. But yes, it would. That project is the other one that we've talked about, at least from staff's recommendation to you all, that would make sense to do it with because we're spending a lot of money anyway. So. I'm sorry, Bettina, you had gotten through the water fund, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Right. So,
What about the bridge on the pedestrian bridge? That would be basically the same cost, Drew?
pedestrian bridge in regards to the Illinois rebuild money?
Exactly. If you
So,
can be used for.
unfortunately, that fund restricts any building works for bridges.
Thank you.
Yeah. There are some real specific projects that are allowed in that spending bucket, if you will, and bridges are not one of them. So as I was saying, the dollars related to these projects in the water fund are made up of the remaining bond money that we had for main replacement and valves and pump station relocation. Is that also part of the bond money, Drew?
Yes.
And then we have the remaining capital projects. Changes to that fund are related to the Green Bay Road Bridge. That's falling off and is being added on later in fiscal year 25. And some reductions to Moffett, Witchwood Storm Interconnect. Then we've also, in general, for this entire summary sheet, we've also plotted out some more realistic, if you will, improvement costs that alternate throughout the period of the next 10 years so that we're planning for example, sewer improvement costs that rotate through the years in a similar way as road repaving does, so that those types of improvements are kept in the picture as far as expenses for those particular years. So that's why you see a lot of patterns of dollars that are projected out in the out years. And then, in the out years of the capital fund, we have the storm place expansion sitting out way out in FY30, and also salt shed replacement in FY26.
So that storm sewer trunk that's the North Avenue, the big tunnel project we've talked about that has been identified in the village's stormwater studies. That is in the excess of $15 million, and that's assuming that maybe there'd be some. We think that's such a huge number for the village to tackle. We're looking for grant dollars and making application. We've applied to the SMC for dollars, knowing that it's not necessarily going to fit their parameters. We're hoping that makes them rethink their grants and maybe create a different pathway for us to try to get additional funding for that. But we're going to try with the Army Corps of Engineers and some other federal dollars and try to find a way to chip away at that and start building that. And hopefully IDOT plays a role in, participating in that. We spent a long time trying to get them to write a letter of support of our grant, which they don't do, which they'll happily tell you they don't do. And then we actually got them to write a letter to help us make the application to the SMC. So they're trying to solve their issues under the viaduct that's all feeds into this same problem. So this is obviously a lot of information to digest and think about, and there'll be plenty of opportunities to continue to have these conversations, but we're certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Drew or Bettina, I had a question about that salt shed replacement. It's a $400,000 item, and I'm thinking to myself, what is the shed that it would cost that much money? I mean, isn't it kind of a structure with 3 sides and a roof, and it's kind of open, and they dump tons of salt on the ground?
Yes. So
It sounds like $400,000 is an awful lot.
it does, and I think that I'm trying to remember. Jake, do you remember the last time you got that number updated?
I think
that was years ago. Remember, we had the consultant come in. We need to make it a little bit bigger so it can hold more. Right now we're kind of handcuffed at that 300 tons. So size-wise, it would go up. There were engineering costs.
Yeah, I think that's. I don't know if that's a conservative number, Barbara. It's been a placeholder for the longest time, but it's. You see, it's not. I think if I ask Jake to answer any more questions, he may reveal some of his frustration about that being put off because they've been dealing with tarps to keep the salt, from being so moist and wet. But it's one of those where. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, didn't we just fund some portion of the structure being rebuilt? I don't know if it was the roof or a wall or something.
There was an HVAC system heaters that went out at the barn, the storage barn that we ended up replacing very recently. But to my knowledge, there has been no investment into the salt barn. Maybe. I don't.
Okay. Thank you. The other question I had was the water tower, $250,000. Is that just one of those, repaint the structure type expenses, or is it more structural?
That's
No,
painting.
Repaint.
Wow.
And this year's number was for washing, right?
Yeah, $10,000 shower.
Got it. Thank you.
I had a quick question about the Green Bay Road West Washington pedestrian crossing. I feel like we pushed that out from last year maybe, or this year. But I can't quite remember. I know there were a couple projects we pushed out. Do we already have a plan for that, or is that something that we'll be starting from scratch? for the 22 budget?
So there have been conversations with the state going back to when, probably even predating, back when the central school was there, but back when they were going to build the new elementary school there, they talked about doing various improvements to the crossings there, and nothing really of note has ever happened. I think the village was trying to do something with the school jointly. But to really answer your question, Trustee Marquis, the answer is that we do not have a specific plan other than the crossing that you see at Sheridan and Scranton, the flashing beacon. That's what that number represents, that we think the state would allow us to do that. Again, because we're gonna have to get a permit and get approval by them, but we think we could be successful in getting that to make it a flashing beacon crossing like that.
Okay. Thanks.
And part of that deals with, I mean, the school does a good job of having crossing guards there during the school hours. But I think at least the concerns that I've heard from residents and Park District users is that, in the summertime or when school's not in session, on the weekend, kids are going to even to play at the playground of the elementary school or go to park events, that the idea that have another means to help improve safety at the crossing, that's what we're trying to be responsive to.
I would agree with that. Thanks.
Thank you for doing that. I'm a runner, and a few times I was pretty close to cars trying to cross that road.
Hey, Drew, one question about all of that. I know in times past, and this has been a while, we've discussed from time to time about whether there's a possibility of a tunnel, maybe also a bridge. Is that, seeing that looking forward into 2030 and so on, we don't seem to anticipate that. Has that pretty much gone by the wayside? That's nothing we're thinking of anymore?
I think that's right. When the village, we actually were rewarded a grant from the state, and the village had prepared to, I'm trying to remember the year, that had been like 08 or 09. The village had dollars from a grant, and the Park District and the school district decided they weren't prepared to pay what I think the village board at the time thought would be their fair share.
Which was about $100,000. That would be about $100,000 for each of the government entities.
It was in some sense trying to be coordinated with the senior housing program that was being discussed for the property next to Jawa. And perhaps it would have been an easier sell if that project had gotten legs to have been able to have made that connection. It didn't work out, and the senior housing program rather didn't work out. And I think that kind of blew a lot of wind out of the sails for that project as well too.
Drew, we don't have any, have we had any fatalities or serious injuries at that crossing that might change some of our thinking about this?
We have had one fatality of a sixth grader back in the late 1990s.
Wasn't that west of here, though?
Pardon?
Wasn't
that was actually a little west of the intersection. He crossed
Yes.
on the road there.
Yeah.
That's the only fatality that that there has been there.
That was on 170, on 176.
176, trying to cross to the other side.
Just so you know.
Near Eva Terrace, or west of Eva Terrace?
Yeah.
Yes, very much near even. Just a little down in one of the houses at that time that were there that the Park District owned.
Okay. So essentially that was really a jaywalking most likely anyway.
It was.
Okay.
Yeah, through the midst of congested traffic.
Right.
I will say that intersection is, if you're traveling on Green Bay Road going north, it's very easy to see people if they're in that crosswalk. If you're traveling south, coming around that curve as you come, let's say the school would be on your right-hand side as you're traveling south, it's very difficult to see that pedestrian crosswalk. Because you kind of come around this big curve and then all of a sudden it's right there in front of you. So the addition of having blinking lights there would be really appreciated. I know lots and lots of kids in the summertime use that crosswalk to get to the pool and to get to the park district. So if that's, if that's our option to do blinking lights like we have up on Sheridan Road, I would love the addition of that.
I would agree, Joy. I think that would be a very positive addition. It's certainly worth the frustration of working with IDOT to be able to do that.
Yeah, it is. I think it's necessary. I think we've been very fortunate that we have not had an incident there.
I would like to support also the fact that we go from a 2-lane to a 1-lane about half a mile before going south, and people are not expecting to come to a school area with a curve, and typically people do not slow down. 25 miles are not speed limit that just don't slow down. And so when there are pedestrians, I mean, again, I will repeat, I'm a runner, and I used to cross back every morning. In many cases, I would be in the middle of the road and people would just pass at 35, 40 miles an hour. Okay? It's a very dangerous area, and I'm amazed children being next to the elementary school, children never got hurt there.
So, Drew, I know you can't control IDOT, but this item is in our fiscal year 22. When do you think we'll actually be having it up and running for fulfilling all of these good safety goals?
Well, I don't know.
How long did it take for Sheridan Road, Drew?
A long time. In fact, in between the time that we actually, after IDOT, I don't want to say definitively, but my recollection was after we put up what we put up, IDOT no longer allowed that type of crossing improvement. They kind of said, oh, well, they changed their mind on that, but I think they've since allowed it again. They kind of like, but it's one of those where it'd be very difficult. I'd say at least a year.
And I think the last time it took at least 2, if not 3.
Yeah.
It was over 2 years.
Yeah.
It was over 2 years.
Yeah. The young woman who came in to advocate for us, I think, had almost, if she hadn't, she was out of high school nearly by the time.
When they proposed that,
Yeah.
It was the kids. They were 8th graders.
Yeah, and I think
They
she
were
was about
virtually
out of high
seniors in
school.
high school when we finally got the permission and got it up and running. So you are talking, once you get with the whole process and thing, it took several years.
Yeah.
So I think that Drew, I'll stick my neck out. I think that there's certainly the will of the committee to advance that particular project.
Yeah. Well, I'll talk to Jeff about putting that to the front of the line.
I think that would be well received by the community.
Great.
Thank you.
Drew?
Mm-hmm.
There were some items in last year's budget that were canceled, red lighted. I remember going through that big list, and there were things that had a red spot or a yellow spot, and one of those projects, wouldn't those types of projects show up on this list? I don't want to talk about something that's too granular or small, but those items that we had red lighted, are all of those on this list that I see here, this big project list? So some of the items that we said no to?
Some of them are on the other bulleted list and not necessarily here, right? Some of that, like the bike racks and all, those are on the list. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that was not reprogrammed, so to speak.
I know we took a pass on the bike path lighting.
Mm-hmm.
That's been pushed out. It's been pushed out. Yeah, it's in the cap plan. It's just pushed further out.
Right.
Yeah.
But then there were also some stormwater issues.
Well, we talked about the Boardman Court. We talked about the deep tunnel project. Is this the master list, Bettina?
Oh, are you finding the actual red light, green light schedule?
Yeah, no. It might be useful to go through that stack ranking again at a finance committee meeting, and understand what's above and below the line.
Exactly. I think we need to.
I mean, we expended a great deal of effort to try to do that.
Actually,
As
I think,
recently as a couple of years ago.
Bettina, can you go down further? I'm looking at the only thing that I'm seeing in here that is not been, I think everything has been reprogrammed except for the interfund transfers, right, Bettina?
And actually, 180,000 of the interfund transfers are back in the projections.
Just
and
not the
included in
450?
this budget.
Okay. Okay, so
Right.
just,
So we took a partial approach to it. Yeah.
but everything else is back in there, including, like, I can tell you, looking that you wouldn't, I did not highlight, but even like going to the one where it talks about the volunteer barbecue, we talked about keeping that excluded, but it's back in there in the commissions, and it's slightly different. I think our take on it this year would be, if we can't do it due to COVID, then I would recommend the village like buy gift certificates at local restaurants for the volunteers and say, go have your own fest. But thank you for your work.
Yeah, no, that would be, but I think it would be useful for us to be able
Sure.
to prioritize and say, would we rather have the light on Green Bay Road, or would we rather have bike racks
Yeah,
and a bike repair station, kind of something on that order,
yeah.
and in order to be a little more responsive, perhaps.
Sure. But I mean, they're all in there. They're just staff's recommended priority. If you, yeah, we can recirculate this. Happy to do it.
Thank you.
Sure. No, to kind of go back to the fund projections just for 1 second. Yeah.
Hijacked you.
I'm sorry. This requested FY22 number does include a $500,000 contribution to the capital fund, along with the 180 for the replacement fund. And that being, sorry if I'm clicking too fast, but that being because the capital fund needs this contribution to stay afloat with the projects that have been assigned to it. And all these projects are listed on that other capital project summary sheet. They're not new. They're just in this fund, so it's a way to get to the fund balance number. And this would be the updated FY22 column, which leaves us with about $440,000 at the end of the year, assuming that all these are completed, and some funding for the years out.
And I know we played with putting monies in and then taking out of the vehicle replacement fund, and it's a big fund, and there's a lot of complex detail in there. But do we feel like that is sufficiently funded at this point?
So I'd be happy to include that in the next finance committee meeting, but because there's quite an extensive sheet that goes through the assets and what the contributions are. I can tell you that in the last 2 years, that fund has grown from what would be called just a normal fund to a major fund, and it now sits at the front of the CAFR. We're sitting on over 1.6 million in it. We have been very conservative in our spending, and just one squad car, and now I think there's a public works piece of equipment that we're slated to purchase this year that's in the budget. But overall, the big expenditure items have not been purchased, so that fund has grown. So my short answer is yes, it should be.
Okay. Thank you. I know that's what I meant. I know you can get very, very detailed, and I kind of just want to get a warm and fuzzy feeling.
Sure.
But we can get down to the details at some other point in time.
Sure.
If just so you know, I'd like to, can I share my screen, Bettina?
Sure.
So I'm
While
gonna.
you do that, I'm going to plug in my iPad, so hang on one second.
Okay. So at the last committee of the whole meeting, there was conversation about the alignment of East Scranton. And I talked about it a little bit, from a funding perspective, my understanding and the consensus of folks that I heard at the meeting was everybody liked I'll call them the Twinkle Lights project. Whether the village ultimately decides to make Scranton, or at least this leg of Scranton, one way is to be determined. But I heard that. So Jeff, and right now we're planning for that to be part of the resurfacing project. At the same time, like I said, we've hired Tesca to help us kind of pre-plan this, but I wanted, at the end of the conversation at the COW, I went back and I met with Jeff and I said, let's go back to the board and share with them the other options that they have in front of them, because it's difficult, I understand, to be difficult to make a decision about deciding whether or not to make a street one way or not knowing the other alternatives. So what other in our CBD alternatives for creating new public parking inventory, what are they? So we have this one for the one way here, which creates the 9 stalls that have been talked about, and would require making it one way. There's another location here on Oak that you can pick up additional stalls. I think these on the east side are a little more, I would say, sketchy. I wouldn't count them, but I know you can pick up additional stalls here, these 4 here. Again, these are not, every one of these alternatives have some sort of, trade-off, right? This particular set of parking brings people from the north, right? It forces them to use North Avenue to come in from a residential area because this section of Oak is one way. And so that forces people to go southbound, so they're having to come through the neighborhood. So that's a negative. It also has tree removal. And the board has talked about this particular project specifically when we were talking about the parking study. And this is something that the board has elected not to do so far, but this is another location where you can pick up additional stalls in the central business district. Again, not perfect, but it's another place. Similarly, south on Oak here, you can pick up another few stalls, but that does interfere with how some of this property is currently utilized. The church rolls through a curb, cut access to park on this brick pad, which has been used by a restaurant over the last several months. But that's not always been the case how it's been used. But the idea of if we can knock out some of those parking bulbs where there's a tree or two, you can pick up stalls there. Again, it's not perfect because we'd have to work with the neighbors and some of the adjacent property owners on how they use the public way. Here in Block 1, the road is sufficiently wide enough to put in angled parking on the north. You can pick up another 6 stalls. The rub there, though, is how the pedestrian experience is versus, parallel, just like here. When you put in nose-in parking, your experience is a little more auto-centric. It's a little more aggressive. You don't have the same experience. And frankly, you don't pick up as many stalls as you do on this section, but the road remains two-way. I would say more aggressively. The village could consider.
Drew, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
For what you just referred to, going in front of neighbors, basically, we had discussed also making that a part of that, those parking places being outside outdoor dining. So how many parking places would we remove at that location?
Well, right now, this considers the parking on the south that's currently blocked off by the Jersey barriers. This assumes that those will be returned back to the parking inventory, that will not be a permanent fixture in the central business district.
Okay.
And I think the general idea is, again, having a conversation, and it came up, Mickey Collins was on the phone, she's the architect, former Plan Commission Zoning Board of Appeals member, mentioned the idea that retail would prefer to have two-way streets versus one-way streets. And so the idea of, and I think that's the conventional wisdom. I think that was a question that's asked, what is the conventional wisdom? I think that's the general response. That being said, I think there's opportunities, there's examples where there are one-way streets in very successful retail environments that function very well, and in cases where most of the studies that have been examined would tell you that it is possible to make this one-way, and when you do that, that may result in cars traveling at a faster rate of speed, and there may be other drawbacks in terms of having fewer eyes on the businesses. But when that's been done, and most of those studies really focus on, I would say, much larger central business districts that have much more higher number of blocks, connected that are one way, versus ours, which is very short. So I think it's a bit of an anomaly, and it makes it that much harder to make decisions like that, right? When you have like you have the Mona Lisa, do you touch it up or don't you? And the idea of changes like this could be viewed, from both sides in different ways. Mrs. Collins and I were exchanging communications about that, and she had mentioned that she had reached out to the planner that does a lot of speaking, and he had made the comment that if you could make a street, if you're going to change a street, no matter what you do, don't make sidewalks less than 15 feet. Well, if we did this, that would be true. And they said, and regardless, if you could maintain the 15 feet, don't ever make a street go one way. So anyway, that was the feedback from one planner. I talked about it with another planner, and they said, well, you could probably put 100 planners in the room and they would argue about it. But anyway, that's just more data for you. And I'm not asking you to decide this tonight, other than I wanted to show you that this is what we've been working on. And let me finish going through these, if that's all right. Chair Anchorman, to go through this.
Please do.
Yeah, so the other alternative that Jeff came up with is taking the Walnut lot, which is currently 20 stalls, and you can add more than 30. You can dead end the street and actually go into this green belt area here, which has very lovely oak trees in it. So there is some negatives. So, you can shrink this in a little bit, but the idea is you can close off this street and pick up more parking stalls here. That does a couple things. It makes, it cuts off the traffic into North Avenue, which could be viewed as a plus. At the same time, now these homes are looking at as parking lot, right? But that's kind of what they're looking at anyway, and you lose this green space, which I think would be viewed as a negative. So again, all of these have pluses and minuses.
Also, just remember that when it goes back, and no board is ever absolutely has to do what another board said, but I will tell you that when that parking lot, Walnut Lot, was put in with the 20 spaces, there was a promise to the neighbors that the other side of the street, which is now green space, would remain green space. So there is, at that point in time, and obviously there is no legal obligation for anything, but I think as you look at these options, please keep in mind that some of the promises that were made.
That's news to me, Kathy, but I'm sure it's true.
I know I've said that before. Okay, maybe he wasn't listening, but I will tell you that was, not that you don't listen to me, folks, but I will tell you that was very loud and clear to the neighborhood at that time. I lived there.
Okay.
So I can tell you that was very loud and clear to the neighborhood.
And then the other option. Yeah.
Drew?
Yes.
I just had one question about the parking lot. So wouldn't the parking lot there be kind of cost prohibitive? Because I feel like when we built that little parking lot there off of Walnut, the existing parking lot, it was quite expensive to build. So like looking at the footprint of what they would want to make out of that, I feel like it would be quite expensive.
What was the cost, Drew, for each of the 20 spaces for the Walnut lot?
It was about $35,000 a stall.
But that included the land acquisition.
That did,
we own
correct.
that land already,
Yep.
Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, and that's the other thing. I'm preparing like a grid or maybe a table that shows, the trade-offs, how many trees would, ballpark remove cost, ballpark cost to do it. Yeah, I mean, certainly the efficiency of doing this, the cost efficiency is substantial, right? Of doing the Scranton versus like a Walnut. This is rather inexpensive, right? The Block 1 stuff's rather inexpensive. I mean, it's just putting paint in. But it's,
Isn't that reducing the size of this, or reducing the size of the sidewalk
we would not have
to do
to,
that north side?
you can do that with existing sidewalk curbs.
That makes it much more appealing. You're not, as a matter of fact, it would even, with the corner bulging out, potentially having some additional green space there.
Yep.
Even if it's just, a hedge or a beautiful single tree.
We've already taken the plunge with the one-way process in front of Block 1 as well. And I honestly think I know that there are some folks who will say that they really like the way life was in Lake Bluff and whenever, but I think that considering the angle parking there and the one way, yeah, it does increase the density. It does reduce the sidewalks, though our mini study of the with local folks have indicated that there's still plenty of space to be able to put dining options on the consequential sidewalks. And the flip side is that for retail people, you get more parking. There's more places to put. People here people don't like to have to walk more than about a half a block to whatever they're doing. And that's a Lake Forest and Lake Bluff habit or tradition or culture or something. And so we do facilitate that process a great deal, which I would think would be of some benefit to restaurants and to retail.
And the lack of, to eliminate parallel parking and putting the angled spot makes it just more inviting for the person who's in the car. It's just so much easier.
It's a lot less complex.
So then,
until the driver had.
Right, the parallel, don't go into the horrors of parallel parking.
Yes, exactly.
But that to me is a more attractive alternate to, for Block 1 than the Walnut and Walnut Avenue suggestion.
and I assume that nobody's interested in hearing about the Metro lot alternative. To Mark's point, it being so far away, but I won't say there's an infinite number of stalls you can add up there, but you can add a lot, and it's just not convenient, right? That's the rub. And you can do it pretty.
It isn't convenient, Drew, but I think that anything that we can do to facilitate our business owners, restaurant owners, and staff parking up there, whether it's lighting, whether it's making it a more attractive option, at the end of the day, facilitates that whole process. I noticed the other day, a couple of weeks ago, a particular business in downtown Lake Forest on Deer Path, and they had all three of their business trucks parked in front of their business on Deer Path in the block just west of Western Avenue. And it's like, don't they understand that their customers can't park there? So to be able to make it more palatable, to enhance the experience for folks for staff to have to walk and make it up there, I think is a plus.
Well, they actually, I have to say that the village has done quite a bit. The lighting has dramatically improved.
It is.
At the train station. I mean, I would go downtown to a play, and come back about midnight, and it was pitch black.
Hmm.
I'm not a scaredy cat, but it was a little nervous.
No, but I'm just,
Now
anything
the
we can
lighting
do.
is much more enhanced. The problem is there will be times during the day, I think you can go down to Lake Bluff and you will see business owners and their vehicles parked right in front. We have an ongoing, believe me, there is still an ongoing problem, no matter how attractive the village has made this by reducing fees for employees, by the lighting and all that. And you have, let's just face it, we have a library that has no public parking. It's all for their employees.
Drew, would it, there are two different, well, there are many different types of people who come to the village, but we certainly have large events like the 4th of July, that perhaps that train station parking would address something that's, you know, it's not frequent, but it does happen every year. We also have the concerts on the village green and things like that, where there can be great numbers of people. And do you feel that the spots that we could open up on the at the train station would be cost effective and actually used?
Well, that's a great question, and I think part of that depends on how much of the office users in Chicago go back post-pandemic. You know, how short is their memory, and have we created a world where, you know, half of the commuters are going back to town and others are, you know, working from home, or, you know, so is the idea of, is the existing inventory going to be available that we haven't previously considered on a more permanent basis, just because people's practices will change, and that, you know, maybe there would be an abundance of existing improved parking surfaces that are not utilized anymore.
Right, but the two events that I talked about, the 4th of July and the Village Green, that's the exact opposite timing of people who use the commuter lot going downtown. So, you know, given those opportunities to try to find parking, do you think that if we had paved more of that train station, that we would get people who are happy to not have to try to parallel park along Sheridan Road during something like a parade?
You know, I might have a hard time recommending to spend those resources for one day a year, right? You know, the idea of people usually find places to park, and it's worked over the years. I think if you're going to spend it, you would spend it on permanent inventory. And the in the Lake Bluff parking study, it talks about this block of East Scranton between Walnut and Oak. That is where the greatest deficiencies in parking are. I mean, the village has we still have a net positive in terms of parking inventory. The issue is, in the critical block, it is the least, right? There's the most deficiencies here versus on the fringes, the bookends, right? So we have parking. It's just not necessarily the most convenient parking.
Right.
I have a question for you, Drew. When I look at the map and I look at the distance, and you say no more than half a block, what about the space, the green, the grass space that is basically where Brookside Cleanery is on the other side of Sheridan, so on the west side? You have all that band of grass.
Here?
On the other side of Sheridan, there.
Yeah.
Because you say, well, we should get rid of trees on Walnut, basically oak trees. Here we have grass, and that might be convenient parking places that are not too far away from the brewery, for example.
You know, it is state right away, and I think the village's comprehensive land use plan has talked about that as, you know, a green belt, a visual, you know, aesthetic green belt. I think when I first came to the village, I pointed the same thing out, and I think George Russell almost hit me with a baseball bat, if I remember correctly. The idea of that being a taboo thought, but that's right. You know, it's not uncommon. Like you drive into Glencoe or other towns, it's very common to have parking just, you know, right by the station in the CBD. You're right, and I saw the same and thought the same. But I think the idea that it's been more of a taboo, and frankly, I don't know if the state would want, you know, if they would want that either, you know, 90-degree or 45-degree parking on their roadway. My guess is they would say, yes, we'll allow you to do that as soon as you take jurisdiction of Sheridan Road.
Drew, I have one other thing, and I'm looking up here at the clock on the wall, as they say, but and it's not anything we can answer tonight, but I think that as we look at what happens in the next maybe 6 to 9 months, and we see how businesses downtown respond long term to COVID and the shifts and working home and things like that, I'd encourage us to give some thought as to whether or not we have the right balance and who's parking where in the current pay lot versus the long-term lot on the other side of the railroad tracks. Because right now we probably have no more than a dozen or 20 cars parking in our pay lot, in our daily lot, and virtually no one on the other side. And how long will that continue? And are we optimizing those two lots? And I don't want to create another discussion other than just to say that might be something to consider. You're trying to be considering all alternatives, and that might be one to think about.
Thank you. I think you bring up a good point, Mark, and I think you also bring up a good point about the informational items that are at the last part of the agenda. So to wrap up the discussion of the budget and the capital, are there any other comments? Because we do need to get to some informational items that staff wanted to share.
No other comments, Chair Ankerman.
Okay. So Drew, looking at the agenda, there were some agenda items for future meeting, water operating budget overview and rate analysis, and some other items. Do you want to briefly touch on those?
There really isn't a lot to say other than the village had talked about we were going to wait to have a conversation about raising water rates after the water meters were installed. And so this is the year we would talk about raising the water rates now that the meters have been installed. And so that's kind of a preview of that. Fee schedule review, there's not a lot to talk about there. The one thing we've talked about doing is last fall when the village updated its ambulance fees, it would not be, we would not have enough data yet from Lake Forest to make a decision in terms of making a recommendation to you all about what to change our ambulance rates. We would not have that till after the reconciliation, which would probably be September. Bettina, you think?
I think it'll be a little earlier. I think she's trying to push closer towards the beginning of their audit.
But so, I mean, that would be the biggest significant rate change probably that we would be talking about, but it would not be part of this immediate fiscal year. There would be nothing else included in that. And then the pay plan would just be looking at our market and what's going on in the world of the market. So nothing of note beyond those points, Madam Chairman.
When we talk about the water overview, would that include any type of ability to see something analyzing if we were able to capture some more of the loss? And that's something that we've talked about over the years, just in general, trying to make that loss number as small as possible. And you know, the water meters hopefully will add to our accuracy.
I think the answer is we are at a point finally where we could start taking more regular measurements and get back to you all with, we think we have the ability to get you better data now. We would need to start making measurements, having Public Works go out there and make those measurements monthly so we can have that data done. I mean, I say yes, the infrastructure is finally where we can start getting that data to come back and report whether we feel like, yes.
Whether we feel like doing it, is what you're trying to say?
No, I think now, only now could we say, yes, we can go out and start collecting that data so you can have that conversation. And it would probably need to take about, I don't know, what, a quarter, 3/4, I mean, or two, 6 months, Bettina, you think this feel like? You felt like we'd have reliable data to say, okay, we know what we bought from Jawa, we know what we sold to our customers, we know what's passed through the pipes.
Right, I think it actually would take a tight window of some daily meters because it doesn't take them very long to do it anymore. And part of the problem has been weather related for us right now versus elsewhere. So we might want to wait till there's no snow.
Yeah, I'm just very anxious to kind of get some of the fruit from, you know, putting in all that capital and, you know, talking about a lot of, you know, things that we've done to try to capture some of that loss. And we've got this great measurement tool. Let's see what we can do to,
Sure.
you know,
Oh, I'm very interested myself.
yeah.
Wasn't part of the expenditure of the event infrastructure was also to buy software that would be able to do that real time. I believe it was at the time when we decided that it was going to be real time. So shouldn't we be able to do that today? Because we bought the software basically.
Right, but the software is still connected to devices that require them to go to certain points in town. So there's still a physical interface with the Public Works person and the technology. It isn't software, you know, push and play on our part. They still have to go out and hit a couple physical points and get the game.
Thank you, Vicky.
Mm-hmm, sure.
Great. Well, I think that, is there another staff report or anything else you want to talk about, Drew?
No, ma'am.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
I'll second.
Second.
Okay. And Drew, do we need a roll call for that?
Sure do. Member Toll?
Aye.
Member Meyer?
Aye.
And Chair Inkerman.
Aye.
And we're all going to
Okay.
stay on this same
We are
call. Same call, so
Okay, that's what was my question. All righty.